Hello everyone, and of course, welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will be your driver on this journey. And tonight, it's going to be a pretty special episode. It's always a special occasion when the world champion doesn't win a tournament, and it looks like that's going to be the case in this year's FIDE World Cup. So we talked about some interesting upsets and some turbulent games going on at the World Cup last week. But tonight, I want to focus on Magnus Carlsen's game in particular, and especially these two games where we saw sort of Magnus breaking against some up-and-coming players who, I mean, they're not necessarily up-and-coming, but they are younger than the current world champ and two top contenders for, quote-unquote, the future of chess. So I want to start with this game between Andrey Esipenko and Magnus Carlsen. So Esipenko is a young Russian player who is, he's been in the 2700s for some time now, and he was really showing his stuff against Magnus. They split in the classical portion, and then we actually saw Esipenko draw first blood against Magnus in the rapid portion. And that's the game that I want to look at first today. So let's start here. Esipenko starts with e4. We get e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and the Giuoco piano in the Italian. So Esipenko starts with c3. We get knight f6, and rather than the more concrete variations with d4, Esipenko plays the Giuoco pianissimo, so the quietest game you can imagine. So of course this is one of the oldest openings in chess, and there's very little left sort of untested, or at least that's what they used to think. These days, this is becoming more and more common at the top level, I think in part because they're sick of playing Berlins all day long, so more players are going for the Italian rather than the Ruy Lopez. And also because they somehow are sort of discovering that black might actually have some issues. I know there's been a lot of discussion over the queenside in particular in these openings. White is taking queenside space a little bit earlier than they used to, and very often is able to make good use of it. But for the moment, let's continue here. Magnus plays d6, white castles, and then Magnus picks this move h6. Now, I am by no means the foremost expert in the Italian, but h6 does feel a little bit early. It seems as though this is not an uncommon move by any stretch, but there's not too much point in playing it right away. It's not as if after castles, black is very terrified of this move, bishop g5. In fact, black tends to be doing pretty well here after h6, g5 and sort of expanding on the king side. With that being said, maybe there was something Magnus didn't like about allowing bishop g5, and so he chose this move h6 first instead. Now, it doesn't ruin anything, but it's just sort of the first move where Magnus is taking the game away from the main variations. You have to do quite a few of these sort of offbeat moves to actually achieve that in the Italian, though. Let's continue on, though. We get rook e1 by Esipenko, castles by black. Now h3 by white is also very normal, especially considering this move h6 has been played. Occasionally, you'll see some kingside garbage, like knight h2 to g4, just to soften up the king side, but that would come much later in the game. And of course, this also has the nice idea of preventing moves like bishop g4, or even knight g4, taking advantage of the fact that this rook is no longer on the f1 square. Okay, continuing now, Magnus plays this move, bishop back to b6. And this one is pretty strange to me. I wasn't really familiar with this move order in the Italian. So why do you think Magnus is playing this move, bishop b6? Any Italian aficionados in the class today who knows what's up with this move? What's Magnus getting at here? Yeah?
I think he's trying to play c5 eventually, so maybe 7 c5.
Okay, that would be news to me. Eric in the class says that he thinks Magnus might be playing for c5. Yeah, that would be a new idea to me. That's not the answer that I came up with personally. But fair enough. Maybe some weird c5 idea in some positions, but I have my doubts, to be honest. Any other days? Yeah, Brian?
I'm guessing we want some more flexibility in how to respond to d4.
Yeah, so not only in how to respond to d4, dropping the bishop back so d4 doesn't come with tempo is potentially an important idea. Although I'm not certain that white should really be playing d4 here anyways. It's a little bit early to be doing it, even though black has wasted some time with h6. I think this would lead to simplifications that tend to favor black. Right? Now black is always going to have this idea, and after rook e8, you may have some difficulties organizing your pieces, especially considering the pressure on the e4 pawn. For example, if you played knight bd2 after rook e8, you would potentially like to bring this knight to f1 to g3, but you might not have the luxury of doing that quite so easily. And also, okay, knight d2, I'm just hanging my d4 pawn. So that's a little bit ridiculous, but the point stands that you're not so comfortable with your e4 pawn yet to be playing d4. And that can often be the problem in these Italians. In order to play a move like d4, you have to be ready on both the d4 and the e4 squares. Personally, what I think it is, number one, it probably doesn't matter that much if you play a move like a6 or a5 or bishop e6 first. And number two, I think that potentially Magnus was less than happy with the positions that we've been seeing. Maybe not b4 right away, but the positions we've been seeing where white is taking all this extra space on the queen side so quickly and easily. This is one of the big new ideas in the Italian. It's not totally new, but this is where they've been testing a little bit. They take all this space on the queen side, and black has some problems. So I think, number one, Magnus was trying to sort of preempt these ideas like b4. And number two, if black got a little bit, or white got a little bit ambitious and played b4 right away, black would be very ready with variations like this when, yes, white has all this extra space, but we'll see that there's an important difference here than with what happens in the game. White has extra space here, but there's really no way to use it. There's no way to break the position open on the queen side. And historically, black has been able to equalize pretty comfortably with an eventual d5 in these positions. But let's continue on. So knight d2, knight e7 is how we continue here. And now after a4, black plays this move c6. So Magnus is preventing this idea of a5, which of course, this is always the common threat in the Italian, a5 and b4, trapping the bishop, so c6 instead. But I think here Magnus is already starting to go just a little bit wrong in his opening prep. So, it's Giuoco pianissimo. It's not that easy to be significantly worse with black, but, and I don't think black is by any means significantly worse here, but it does start to get tricky to play over the next few moves. So now that we've played c6 and h6, white decides it is time to break through with d4. Why can we play d4 here when we didn't want to a few moves ago? Well, it's because black gave up a lot of pressure on white's central pawns in order to reorganize the pieces. We no longer have this knight threatening d4, and the rook is a couple tempi away from hitting e4. Black continues out now with knight to g6. We see bishop back to f1, rook e8, and then Esipenko organizes his pieces with queen to c2. And now we see Magnus continue with bishop to c7. And I want to stop here because this is really where Esipenko takes at least a psychological advantage, if not an actual advantage according to a computer. So black just plays bishop c7, and this seems to be Magnus's big plan. He's rerouting the bishop back to c7 without spending any time on a6 or a5 on the queen's side. So first, let's try to figure out, what is Magnus's idea? Why is he putting this bishop back on c7? Why this diagonal rather than this diagonal? To pressure h2, says the YouTube chat. I'm not so sure that's the reason. There's a lot of stuff in the way here, right? So yeah, Niels in the chat also says to protect e5. So why is protecting e5 relevant here? What's the big move that black is trying to play? D5, right. So as long as white has this pawn duo in the center and black doesn't, then white is going to have a little bit of extra central space and can potentially claim one day that this is going to be some kind of advantage. I have more space, my pieces can move a little bit more freely, so I have an advantage. So what Magnus is trying to do is, if we get some nothing move by white, Magnus is trying to play d5 with now the support of the c7 bishop on the e5 pawn. So why is this bishop important? Well, because whenever you play d5, again, you have to be comfortable with both of these squares. And after something like takes, now we would have three pieces attacking e5. And so we need the bishop for backup to make sure we're defending this square enough. So that's why bishop c7. So now the challenge as Esipenko is, you know that Magnus is trying to basically just totally equalize with the move d5. If black can successfully play d5 in the Italians, generally it's just totally equal, like unless white gets some dynamic advantage. So how do you want to play against this idea of d5? And I guess it is important to note, I sort of lied to you there. Black probably isn't playing d5 right away, because after takes, it's not super clear what the best way to recapture on d5 is for black. In fact, black probably wants to take d5 with the bishop, so Magnus is likely going to be supporting this move with bishop e6 before playing d5. So you basically have two tempi to figure out what to do. You know, d5 isn't super strong yet because black has no good way to recapture, but after bishop e6, d5 is going to be coming. Okay, so d5 for white would be an idea, but I'm not certain if we can make that work. And in fact, it might be helping black more than we want here. For example, you know, even if we weren't hanging a pawn with d5 right now, let's say we tried to prepare it or something. Well, black is going to take on d4 the second we play this move, and now his own pieces are going to be able to enter the fray. So it's not the most common idea here. In fact, I was kind of scrubbing through the database to find similar games, and I couldn't really find one that features this idea, at least in a position that looks like this.
What about queen b3?
Queen b3? Okay, what's the point? To stop bishop e6, I guess?
Yeah.
Yeah, potentially, yeah. But I mean, we literally just played this move queen c2 to defend our e4 pawn. Yeah, okay, all right. maybe not, though. Maybe we don't want to waste quite so much time. I'm also not convinced you can take this pawn in many lines. But okay, black can play a little bit more slowly, something like queen e7, and just continue improving the pieces. Okay, so queen b3. Let's say queen e7, and you're saying d5 here. Yeah, I'm not so sure. I think takes is this so good for white? I don't know. Okay, all right. Eric's taking my free pawn. I'm going to come out here. Queen c6. Okay, I mean, how is your queen not trapped? What kind of joke is this? Okay, maybe I'm misplaying this. Maybe I'm misplaying this. All right, let's say bishop back to c6 or b6. All right, Eric is causing me too much trouble. All right, let's think here for a second. Let's think here. Take. You really just want to get away with this, huh?
Maybe it's not that good, but I don't know. I don't see it.
Okay, let's. All right, I flinch first. I'll go rook b8. You know, the more I'm looking at it, the less I like it. I think I just want to play bishop e6 here and go for something concrete.
Yeah, this might be okay.
Isn't your queen kind of trapped?
Queen a6.
Queen a6. Okay. All right, I have to cheat. Eric's too good at chess. I have to cheat. So what's wrong with queen b3? Let's find out. Yeah, nothing is wrong with queen b3. Black can play something like a5 though, and go back to normal play on the queen side. Yeah, I don't know. The queen just doesn't really feel like it belongs here. It's putting on some pressure, but yeah, the problem with d5 is okay. There you go. That's the problem with d5. It just gives too many squares. It doesn't feel right to be giving away all these squares, right? That's sort of the point of the pawn on c6 as well. Okay, so something better than queen b3. So I'm just going to kind of give it away here. Very often. What?
Can I make one more guess?
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
D takes e5.
D take e5. So d takes e5 is definitely an important idea in the position for white. And I think if black were to take back with the pawn, then I think white would be pretty happy here. This pawn is sort of in the way of all of black's pieces. But the problem with it immediately is I think black is going to be trying to take back with the knight. And the point now is we're sort of revealing some pressure here on the e file. But
Knight takes and f4.
knight takes and f4.
Too much?
Yeah, so this is super scary, opening this diagonal. It's always scary.
Right.
I don't know where you want to go, but okay, even here, like I have some very silly ideas. But let's just say rook e8. And I'm not so sure that this e5 idea is sort of what the direction that white should be headed. So what Esipenko does is he takes the slower GM approach. So rather than some direct idea where he's like, okay, d5 is impossible now, what he does is he tries to prepare his pieces for the opening of the position, right? And that's what a lot of these Italian games are all about at these super high levels. They simply want to make their pieces as good as possible to prepare them for the break. So what white piece isn't really in the game right now? Well, it's this bishop on c1. So what Esipenko does is he kind of takes advantage of Magnus's lack of this a5 move, and he takes this opportunity to play b4. Magnus now does play bishop e6, getting ready for d5, and now Esipenko plays bishop b2. So what's the point? Well, the point is now if black plays d5, white actually has numerous moves here that start to make his position make a whole lot of sense. For example, yes, you have to calculate all these captures as Magnus Carlsen, but not only do you have to calculate those, but you have to calculate c4 as well. And I get the feeling this is the kind of thing that was giving Magnus some pause in the game.
It's a nice row of pawns.
Yeah, all pawns to the 4th rank, right? And what's the point of this move? Well, the point is if you play some sort of laissez-faire pawn capture, I'm going to take back on e5. And things are getting very difficult for you on this diagonal. You definitely don't want to allow takes because your king side is just going to get totally shattered. And you can't really get away with just playing something like knight d7 here, because I'm just going to take back. And not super clear if you're immediately going to get this pawn back on e5 or not. Not super clear, especially for a rapid game. And beyond that, if you think you're going to take here, who sees the easy way for white to just be crushing in this position? Crushing positional edge here. So always be on the lookout for combinations like these when things are in flux in the center. The idea is going to be we want to keep the center in such a way where our pieces have a lot of squares and our opponent's pieces don't really have good squares. Easier said than done sometimes. Neil in the chat says e5 looks like a good move, and I think this is sort of the wrong direction. E5 is taking away squares from our pieces, right? We want this knight to be able to look at these squares. We want the rook to be able to breathe. We want this bishop to be able to see.
Maybe e takes d5, knight takes d4.
Yeah, so let's start with ed5. So I think this is sort of a must, right? We want to open this diagonal first of all, open the e4 square, open these squares, open this diagonal. So black takes back. And then you said knight takes d4. And it's true that our pieces have good squares here, but I think the problem is that our opponent's pieces are also going to have good squares, right? The center just gets totally blown up. So there's actually something better in this position. Yeah, that's exactly right. So we go c5. Oh, and so many arrows. But the point is, this bishop is on a good diagonal. We can bring this bishop and queen to a good diagonal. This knight is coming to a good square by force. And this knight we don't really care about. But actually, it can come out to f3 after knight d4 and help support our attack. In the meantime, we've actually deprived black of some pretty important squares. Namely, the d5 square is a really, really important square that black just doesn't have access to because the pawn is in the way. And so this is just going to be a big edge for white as well. Now, the good news for Magnus here is that you can actually still maintain the balance more or less. You just have to find this move, knight e4. And after knight e4, it turns out that there's not really an easy way for white to maintain an edge here. I think if it takes on d5, okay, I'm already forgetting my prep here. But okay, so if d takes e5, then we simply take on d2 and take on c4. So black's not super concerned about, quote unquote, losing this pawn on e5. And if c takes d5, I guess this one is slightly more complex, but I think we're just able to take on d2. We're not worried about this variation. Oh, and that's the end of the game for you, but we'll get to that later. We'll get to that later.
I mean, we could see that coming.
Yeah, obviously. Obviously, everybody saw that coming. So we got to b4 here, and we were looking at d5, c4, knight e4. So the cd5 takes here, and after takes back, we're just going to be able to take. And again, the whole center is going to kind of blow up here. And in this variation, actually, white is probably losing because we're just losing a pawn. So I think ideas like c4, ideas like take and then c4, take and then c4, all these different ideas were kind of scaring Magnus a little bit. This is sort of not the most common idea in the Italian, this bishop b4 and bishop b2 idea to start pressuring the center. So what's the point? What can you actually learn from this game? Well, the point is that sometimes, when your opponent has an idea like d5, there's not really a good way to just prevent it outright. Especially in these e4, e5 positions where both players are really fighting for the center. Sometimes the best way to play against it is to prepare your pieces for the opening of the position. You can't really stop your opponent from ripping open the center, but you can put your pieces on the best squares possible so that you can give your opponent problems once the position does open up. And that's exactly what Esipenko does here with b4 and then bishop b2. So just always be on the lookout. If you can't kind of calculate your way to an advantage for you, like d takes e5 isn't getting us anywhere, this queen b3 move was giving me problems, but it's sort of the wrong direction. Our queen is here to defend our e4 pawn. And so these concrete things aren't really getting us anywhere. So what we need to do is just keep improving our pieces, locate our worst piece, find out how to improve it, and then we'll be better suited for the opening up of the position. Now, what happened in the game is even worse for Magnus than that. I think white might have a slight edge in those d5 positions, but nothing too crazy. Instead, Magnus plays this move a5. And I think this is just a bad move, basically. So a5, how should white respond? Our opponent is attacking our pawn on b4. It's terrifying, honestly. Yeah, just b5. We don't really want to just let it sit because we want to be able to capture with the pawn on d4. So just b5. And the problem now for Magnus is this position is very, very different than the position I kind of showed a little bit ago. In the position I showed a little bit ago, we saw this bishop on b6 and this pawn back on c7. And there I was saying black is kind of doing okay. But here, black definitely is not doing okay. And who can tell me why? Why isn't black doing okay here? What's the big difference?
Well, white can't open d5 because there was an option to pull off force.
Yeah, and that's actually the main point here. So white is able to open the b file sort of whenever he wants. And this is why the position is so bad for black. Usually, in these Giuoco pianos, it's not a huge deal that white has a little bit of extra space on the queen side. But here it's a lot more important because the easiest way to use a space advantage is to open things up on the side of the board where you have more space. Why is that? Well, when you have more space in the position, then you can much more easily organize your pieces to attack weaknesses than your opponent can to defend their weaknesses. So in this case, black is going to have kind of a myriad of weaknesses on the queen's side, and white is very easily going to be able to maneuver the pieces to put some pressure on them. In the meantime, with such limited space to work with back here, black isn't really going to be able to defend those very effectively. So at this point already, I think Magnus is in quite a bit of trouble. He continued now with bishop b6. By the way, it's a little bit too late to go for something like queen e7, rook d8, and try to play d5 still, because at this point I think white is just going to play this move c4. And the difference now is that we're not so worried about this knight coming to e5 because, again, we're just ripping things open on the queen's side, and black is going to be in quite a bit of trouble. Like knight e5 here, for example, maybe we do play this f4 move. No, we definitely don't play that f4 move. But you can kind of see the point, right? We're pressuring over here. We're able to put on some pressure here. Our knight can come to f5 now, and things are getting quite scary for black. So instead, Magnus plays bishop b6, and that's how you can really tell that things have not gone according to plan for Magnus Carlsen. Right, he goes c6, bishop c7, with the idea of going a5, bishop b6. Not so good, not so good. So the question now is, how do we take our space advantage and turn it into something concrete? I kind of told you we want to look for the right moment to open things up on the b file and attack black's weaknesses. But how do we find that right moment? So the key of this game is to use the space advantage. Big advantage in space. That's why Esipenko is better.
I would consider rook A to B1, bishop A3.
Yeah, and that's actually exactly right. We don't want to start with rook A to B1 because this move might be annoying. But bishop A3 first is exactly what Esipenko does. And the point now is we are clearing the path on the B file. We're going to put a rook there, and then we're going to take on C6 when black isn't ready for it. Magnus tries this move, queen C7. Esipenko isn't concerned, just goes with rook to B1. And now Magnus is actually the one who gets a little impatient here and plays C takes B5. And after this move, I think black is pretty close to just busted. This move is not so good. But the bad news for Magnus is, I mean, if you sort of just continue nonchalantly, then it's not really going to help. For example, here, let's say, I don't know, let's just say like rook C1, for example, to sort of keep the balance over here. You run out of moves pretty quickly as black. Like, I guess you can play rook B1. I'm going to start to double up, though. And you're really going to have problems down this B file in the very, very near future. Like, let's say you pass, for example, H5 or something, king H7. Even now, I might be ready to come here. And it's tough to deal. It's tough to deal with all these threats. Knight C4 is coming as well. And white's pieces are just better prepared for the opening of the position. You know, I have more space, so I can double my rooks. So what Magnus does instead is he forces the issue with C takes B5, but I think his calculation here just wasn't quite on point. So after bishop takes B5, of course we want to keep the B file open, and we want to play with tempo whenever possible. We get rook to C8, and Magnus, I think, was expecting that his counterplay against this C3 pawn might be enough to get him back in this game. So how do we deal? How do we deal with these problems that Magnus has given us? He's only the world champion.
What about D5, knight C4? Is that what?
No, so D5 is the right idea. The problem here is if you just simply defend your pawn or something, you're pinned on the C file. E takes D4 is not too hard to find. So D5 first is great. We just want to gain a tempo on this bishop and give us time to do something. Bishop D7. And now knight here, I think, does actually lose. Of course, the problem is going to be this move. I guess you're saying we can take this? Is that what you wanted?
I didn't calculate that.
All right.
Yeah.
We didn't calculate anything, but that's okay. Maybe you can take this guy.
Yeah,
Even,
that's what
but
I was
yeah. Esipenko finds better here. You don't need to find all that craziness. Esipenko simply plays bishop f1 and sort of calls Magnus's bluff here. If you take on c3, I think the simplest is probably just to take. Now both bishops are attacked, but I can save mine, and you've got problems here. You've got problems here. I have a problem here, but you know your three problems are sort of more important than my one. And I think Esipenko is just kind of crushing here, down the B file. Again, when you have extra space, things tend to be good for you on the side of the board where you have extra space, especially when things open up. So just bishop f1, and Magnus plays this slightly weak move, rook a to b8, just sort of trying to defend. Here already, though, I mean, the position is pretty bad for Magnus. Now Eric's idea does come into play with knight c4. This is just the way to add more pressure. And kind of out of nowhere, it's very difficult for Magnus to defend a5, to defend d6, to defend b7. The only move to stay in the game is bishop c5. And now Esipenko simply captures, and goes rook b6. And already this is sort of the end of the game for most normal players. Magnus, of course, puts up like horribly strong resistance all the time because he's Magnus Carlsen. But you just can't deal with these three separate problems all at the same time. In the meantime, I mean, what is Black doing? He's just defending. So d6 is attacked twice. Due to Black's space disadvantage, it's very difficult to defend. The only move is knight e8. No other legal way to defend this pawn, aside from rook c6, which is not so good. So knight e8. We just double up on the b file, not a hard move to find. Rook queen c7. We triple up on the b file, not a hard move to find. Queen back to d8. Ben Feingold setting up for the next game, as always. And then, I mean, this pawn is hanging, this pawn is hanging, and this pawn is hanging. Like, not only can Black not deal with all three problems, but he can't deal with any of them. Like, nothing. He can't defend anything. And that's just, again, because of his lack of space. Esipenko finds a good move, which is queen a3, not taking any of the pawns, but just getting ready to take on a5. Queen b6, we take on d6, take on d6, take, bring the other rook into b6, and this position is something like +5. Like, it's real bad, real bad at this point. At this point, Magnus just plays f6, and then Esipenko plays like a very bad move in the form of queen to a1. Much simpler, I think, is to just push this pawn forward. Magnus can try to take it, but like you have very serious problems with this bishop on d7. Like bishop b5, for example, is a good move, and not so clear how Magnus is going to get out of this one. But okay, queen a1 instead doesn't really spoil too much. Knight h8 is the big rerouting maneuver for Magnus, but at this point, Esipenko just keeps up the pressure and manages to convert. Bishop b5, just to give his rooks a little bit more freedom on these light squares. Rook b6 is important, otherwise you lose that rook. Queen c5, take, queen c4. And we're going to kind of zoom through towards the end of the game here. Black's other weaknesses start to fall, and Esipenko's a good enough player to keep track of his own weaknesses in the meantime. Queen takes c3, take, and white is up 2 pawns here, which is enough. Rook c4, just a5. If you take here, I go a6. Rook f8 is Magnus's idea, but now knight h4. And again, if you take here, I think knight g6 is the problem. And again, sort of everything is falling. Knight d8 is Magnus's response. We get rook e7. Magnus takes off the rook, f3, and I mean this is just sad. This d pawn is too strong. D pawn is too strong. G4 takes some space. G6 is how Magnus tries to break out. You really can't move any of your pieces otherwise. So G6, good enough try. We enter this sort of forcing variation. Knight G6, rook D6, take. And then Esipenko doesn't have to work too hard to find the win here. He goes rook H8, transposing to the king and pawn endgame. And then everybody calculated this one from 5 miles away. But what's the cleanest win here? What's the cleanest win for white? One last test for you. All right, Brian wants to play f4. I think all the moves win. This might be the least clean. He's going to take, go king e6. And here you definitely still win this endgame, so maybe it's all good. Maybe it's all good. I like Esipenko's way the best, which is he goes g5. And the point now is that after takes, black is still going to come after our pawn on the queen side, but we can go king d4, get in front of the pawn, and still promote ours, I think. No, king d4 is ridiculous. King d6 is what Esipenko played, and it's the best. And the point now, as everybody saw from a mile away, is that after queens, your king is in a bad spot. And this queen is dying. So g5, and you just got to calculate a little bit to get to the end. Originally, I thought his idea was going to be to go king d4, with the point being we're in time to stop the pawn if you do this. But then I sort of realized that maybe this isn't so simple if I go king b6 here. So no need to deal with all that. You just do the calculation and get to the end. So what happened this game? Let's recap a little bit. It all sort of happened back here in the opening, and that's why I spent so much time back here. In these Italian positions, there is so much going on. There's so many different options for both players, and it can be really difficult to find good moves like b4 and bishop b2. But that's what Esipenko does to beat up on Magnus Carlsen here. So what's the point to take away? The point to take away is that in any given position, especially in these e4, e5 positions, oftentimes the best thing you can do is just identify your worst piece and improve it. In this case, Magnus played a slightly offbeat line, chose not to move the a pawn, brought the bishop back to c7 very early, and Esipenko realized maybe I can take advantage of that to improve my bishop. And that simple idea is what sort of snowballed into this game getting out of control for Magnus Carlsen. So questions on this game. It's a very dense game to start with. Lots going on here, but I think we kind of got through it start to finish. Any questions? All right, everybody loves the Giuoco pianissimo. Everybody loves it. Okay, with that, let's get on to the main event for the last 17 minutes of the class. Everybody wants to talk about Magnus Carlsen getting destroyed by Jan Duda in the tiebreaks of the semifinals. So I figured I better go over this game because even though Jan broke my heart and played the Sicilian rather than the Caro, it ended up just looking like a very, very good Caro-Kann. So I want to talk about the Sicilian variation a little bit and about what went wrong for Magnus here. So we do get a Sicilian. Magnus plays knight f3, d6, and of course we get the bishop b5 check line. So Magnus has been doing this for quite a while, I think. Of course, this is game 2 of the rapid tie breaks in their match setting, and Magnus drew round 1 with the black pieces, so he's trying to put on a little bit of pressure, but it's not like he's in a must-win or anything, so he's just playing chess. We get bishop d7 by Duda. This is probably, I think, the safest line for black. You can play knight d7 and try to go kind of crazy over here. You can play knight c6 as well. But bishop d7 is sort of the move that says, you know, I don't believe in your bishop b5 idea. I'm going to keep it simple, and we can trade these bishops if you like. So bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, castles, knight f6, and then I really don't like this variation for white. It's a very common variation, so it can't be that bad, but I simply just don't like it for white, because what we get is after queen e2, knight c6, c3, e6, d4. We're going to trade c-pawns. I get to go d5. Now after e5, knight e4, it looks like a very good Caro-Kann. It's a Caro-Kann where I'm not getting checkmated. It's Caro-Kann because the light squared bishops are off the board, and the c-file's open, and I'm not even close to getting checkmated. I even have this nice active knight out here on e4. Now in the game, Magnus chooses the simplest variation, which is knight d2, just trading off this knight. And then here already, I think black has no problems. And as a Caro-Kann player myself, I tend to prefer these positions. So what could Magnus do instead? Well, Magnus could not play this dumb bishop b5 opening, but aside from that, c4 is apparently a very common way to play here, and you get more Marazzi bind type positions. That being said, light squared bishops off the board, it shouldn't be too scary for black. And even here, I think something like rook e1 and sort of testing with something like b3 would be a little bit of a better way to play. c3 here as well, though, is perfectly fine. And we would end up in kind of similar positions here with e5. I just don't really like this variation for white, to be honest. You know, it just doesn't feel like much. Let's get back to the game, though. So this is the opening variation that Magnus Carlsen has chosen. I think Duda was prepared a little bit beyond this point still. But let's stop here and figure out how we're going to organize our pieces. So we've played through the opening, and now how do we continue? So first and foremost, we have to develop this bishop, and bishop e7 is a likely candidate, and that is the normal move. Duda instead chooses bishop b4. I think both are fine. Duda is happy to draw with the black pieces, though, so he's like, yeah, okay, let's trade pieces. Magnus plays bishop f4, keeping the bishops on the board. Now we castle, and queen d3. So now, okay, I mean it this time. Let's pause and figure out what's going on in this position. How do we organize our pieces? And what is white trying to do? What is black trying to do? What is white trying to do? So there's sort of a balance that we have to keep here with the black pieces. So what do we want to do with black?
Expand on the inside.
Yeah, as always, you want to play on the side where you have more space, or the side where your pawns point, because that's where you have more space. In this case, our pawns are pointing to the queen's side. We have more space over there. We want to get our rooks on the c file, challenge the c file, invade on the c file, maybe bring our knight into a square like c4, and potentially shove some pawns down the board on the queen side as well. This is what we'd like to do, but what's stopping us from doing that? What's stopping us from just going, rook c8, a5, b5, a6, b5, knight a5? Yeah, if we get too ambitious and just kind of go wild over here, we got to start looking out for moves like knight g5. If we have to play g6, then, let's just say knight back here, bishop here, and it can get scary. It can get scary on the king side if we let it happen. So for that reason, Duda starts with bishop e7 here. So it kind of seems like we both wasted some time in the opening, moving our bishop multiple times, but both sides wasted the time, so it's not a huge deal. So bishop e7 first, and now a3. So trying to stop any piece from landing on b4 perhaps. So now the question is, we probably want to bring a rook to the c file, but which rook? Which rook do we use? So there should be an intuitive one, but then because I'm asking, you're probably going to ask, you're going to guess the other one, right? So what's the intuitive rook to move over?
The A rook.
Oh God, that's not the intuitive one at all.
Is intuitive. Wait, really?
Yeah, so intuitively I would want to move the f rook over to the c file. Now why is that? Well, it's because I want to play on the queen side. Maybe I want to open up the b file later, and I want to have this a rook over here to help with that. But speaking from experience, sometimes you want to have this rook over here to help defend your king a little bit. So maybe that's why Eric just intuits the correct move, rook a to c8. And so rook a to c8 is the move that Duda plays. I don't think it's a massive deal in this position, but just in general, it's nice to have this rook on f8 sometimes to help defend your king. Rarely, if some craziness happens, the f file might open up, and it could be good to have a rook here. Obviously, we are a ways away from anything like that happening. But rook a to c8. White plays this move g3 now. And again, this is why I just don't really like this variation for white. It feels like the kingside attack isn't really going anywhere, and black more or less has a free hand just to play on the queen's side. So knight a5 by Duda, and position's technically just dead equal here, but I think I would much prefer to be playing with black.
What's the idea with G3?
What's the idea with G3? I think the idea is very deep. It's making luft for the king. I really think that's all that's going on here. White can also try to play h4. Sometimes, though, you want to have the pawn on g3 first, so your knight isn't stuck to the h4 pawn. So yeah, shoring up the h4 square perhaps, and making luft for the king. Risk says, is this a Caro-Kann structure? And yeah, basically, we got here from the Sicilian, but this is just a very good Caro-Kann, in my opinion. What's the difference? Well, black played c5 in one turn, and then white slowly but surely struck back in the center. So rook a to c8. Then we get g3 by white. Again, it looks like a mysterious move, makes fluff for the king, and shores up the structure for an eventual h4. Knight a5 is very, very logical for Duda. And then Magnus plays this move b3. So b3 is a pretty big concession by Magnus Carlsen. Generally, when in these positions, when they play a3, they would like to be going b4. But in this position, I think that Magnus simply didn't like the move a5. Now, I could be wrong here. I didn't prep this one super far, but I think a5 is just causing too many problems for white. Your only idea is going to be to play b5, or I guess theoretically, something like rook b1. But let's say b5, and here, black is just on the file first, and things are going to get awkward. Going to get awkward for white. So no b4, and instead b3. So now Duda has already made a lot of progress on the queen's side. White has played a3 and b3, which really softens up both these pawns and some squares on the queen's side. So how do we continue now? How do we continue on the queen's side, giving white problems? And Julian in the chat says, "My boy," in reference to Jan Duda. I believe that's due to them sharing a middle name, which I will now attempt to pronounce live on stream. Krzysztof. There you go, Krzysztof, final answer.
Jan. That's part of his first name, right?
Krzysztof Duda. Yeah, it's Jan-Krzysztof is his name, as Ben Simon correctly points out. Julian, it's just his middle name. Great Wolf says it's okay to butcher it. I think people have done worse. People have done better, but I think they've done worse. Okay, Randy just says, don't pronounce the KR, just Krzysztof. Good enough for me. Back to business, though. Thank you, Brian. How do we pressure these pawns?
I was thinking doubling rooks first.
Okay, yeah, you can double the rooks. White's going to challenge you on the file, likely. Yeah, I mean, eventually we need to reroute this knight. But Jan-Krzysztof comes up with a very direct way to put on pressure. Yeah, what's up, Eric?
A6, queen b5.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A6, preparing queen b5 is an important idea here that Jan comes up with. And the point is, we're simply pressuring this pawn on b3, and it can be quite awkward to defend. I don't think we want to move our knight away just yet. And the reason for that is if white ever plays b4, it's nice to be ready with this move knight to c4. So queen c6 is actually how Jan starts. And the point here, I think, is that after rook c1, queen b6 is also a good idea. But the same idea is to get to the b file, right? So queen c6 to start, we get bishop d2, queen b6, rook b1. And now Eric's idea of a6, queen b5 comes into play. And it's pretty nasty what Jan is doing to Magnus here. He's just sort of bit by bit taking away all the squares on the queen side. Again, it's easier to play on the side where you have more space. The same idea. King g2 by Magnus. And now before queen b5, we do have to solve the problem of our knight. So we get knight back to c6, rook e1, and queen b5. This is not actually going to be a very comfortable structure for white at all. We have too much pressure coming down the a file, and I don't think white's going to be very happy with that. So we get queen back to b1 instead. And now finally, now that we've locked up a lot of white's pieces, Jan just doubles on the c file and continues with a5. Okay, we get rook h1, a4, forcing more weaknesses into white's camp. b4, and okay, h6, a little bit of a slower move just to stop any ideas for white here. Knight g5 is never really working, because we just go g6, and you're way too slow on the king side. You know, worst case, my king can run. So bishop e3 instead. Now knight back to a7, and you know, Jan has kind of just been super professional about it. He just forces Magnus to weaken all his squares, takes over the c file, and now he's going to bring his knight into b5 and end the game. We get queen e2, queen c4, and knight b5. And all of a sudden, white is just kind of lost here. And we're running short on time, so I'm going to sort of zoom through the rest of the game in a minute. But this was the meat of the chess game, basically. You know, Magnus gets nowhere on the king's side, and then all of a sudden, Jan just takes over on the queen's side. So I want to make sure we have a good understanding of what happened here. Because really, it was in these few moves where b3 was played, a6, this queen b5 idea came into play, and all of a sudden, it's just Jan who is pushing for this entire game here. So questions about how Jan managed to take over. Okay, I mean, he just makes it look easy, right? But the important things to remember this game are, you know, target the points that your opponent has weakened in their structure, right? a3, b3 makes all these squares weak, and that's where Jan starts targeting, first with queen c6 to b6, and then queen b5, taking over more squares. And then after doubling, we see him go a4, provoking b4, weakening this pivotal c4 square as well. Now, according to the engine, white is still technically doing okay here if you find some concrete ideas like rook b2, giving this guy up for like rook a2, and then pawn here. And things are going to liquefy a little bit. But Magnus, of course, doesn't find those ideas in the game, goes b4, and now it's just worse for the rest of the game. All right, so let's continue on, pressing forward. We get knight b5, rook d3, and Jan takes his time about it, brings his bishop into play as well, just targeting all of the weaknesses in white's camp, and white's sort of helpless to do anything about it. Bishop e3, now knight c3 is good. Get queen b5, rook c2, knight e4. One trade of rooks, and now after rook to d1, there's a very strange decision by Jan here. I think he should just take this and put his rook on c3 and just be crushing. You have to defend this guy. And then, I don't know, even rook b3 here. And this pawn is not long for this world. But instead, Jan chooses rook c4, keeping the queens on the board. We get knight d2, take, queen c6, and even here. This is just very, very tough for Magnus. And after queen c4, the deal is more or less, well, should have been more or less sealed. Black is just crushing with this very, very active rook. Now, because Magnus is too strong, he manages to create problems with d5, which we're going to zoom right through here. So d5, and Magnus's idea is to go rook d2. Now, the simplest here is actually the nice move rook a3, and then rook d3, when two passive pawns are going to be enough to win the game. Instead, though, Jan misses rook a3, goes rook d3 right away. And after that, we get this sort of obscene bishop endgame, which maybe Robert Hungaski will go over in his endgame class to follow. Maybe not, though. We don't have time to go into all the details here, but basically, there's a lot of back and forth. Magnus comes up with this nice defensive idea, playing king takes d3. You're not able to actually take this pawn on f4 due to a nice breakthrough idea of going g6 and e6, e7, when it's actually white who might be winning the game. So instead, we see g6 by Jan, now threatening king takes here, maybe, unclear sometimes. So we get bishop back to e3, bishop back to c7, and now Magnus plays b5. And this is sort of the beginning of the end. Magnus sort of had to find this clever bishop c5 move here, and or just repeating with king d4. So Magnus, short on the clock, wasn't able to calculate whether or not he was actually okay in this endgame. Turns out this is a draw, but understandably, he wasn't able to calculate that super, super quickly. And he also missed this nice trick of bishop c5. Now the problem is, if you take here, I'm just going bishop d6, takes, isn't going to get it done, and bishop d8, Now the problem for you is that this move is check. So missing both those ideas. He plays b5. Now all of a sudden, black has a plan for improvement. He goes bishop d8. We repeat a couple times, bishop e7. And then Magnus misses his last chance to draw. Could have gone bishop d4. Looks very, very scary, but manages to keep the balance here with some ideas of king b6. Instead, he goes bishop back to c1. And now after bishop c3, it's actually going to be game over here. There's no way for white to stop d4, d3, d2. You might think you can do it with bishop e3, but you're going to get checked and just destroyed anyways. In the game, Magnus came up with b6 himself, and after d4, king to c4, king d7, bishop e3 was his big trick, hoping for takes and takes. But now Jan just picks up the a3 pawn, and this is not a pretty endgame for Magnus. Takes, takes, and here Magnus Carlsen resigns and throws away his chances of winning the 2021 World Cup. How dare he resign? Of course, this is just dub lost. He's going to take all these pawns, and Jan Duda advances to the finals of the World Cup. So tough tournament for Magnus. We analyzed 2 of his toughest losses, and he did have some good games this tournament as well. One really interesting queen sack, but a very chaotic tournament for Magnus Carlsen, definitely. So with that, that's all I have for you guys tonight. It's time for me to turn over the microphone to Robert Hungoski with Insane in the Endgame. Be sure to stick around for that, and be sure to tune into that online as well. So as my name is Caleb Denby. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.